I had a political science professor at the University of Delaware who gave me two great lessons about politics and two phrases that he gave me. I'll talk about the first one. He talked about how essential listening was to leadership. He said, tell me all the time that great leaders listen much more than they speak. And I said to him, why do you think that makes the most effective leaders? And he said, because without listening, he said, you want to be followers. He said, remember something, Chris, a leader without followers is just a guy out for a walk. And it is true today as well, that we have a president who I believe no longer listens. He listens to a very small, insular group of people around him. And I've said this publicly before, and I'll say it again, that when I look back on this presidency, I think it will be marked by one phrase more than anything else. Often wrong, but never in doubt. That's a dangerous thing to have in a president of the United States. Reagan won over the American people by listening to what their concerns were, what their interests were, what their fears were, and what their aspirations were. And he protected American interests first and foremost and unapologetically to anyone else around the world or here at home. This most recently has come up with the Syrian refugee issue. Now, let me be clear about this. Any policy, if it's meant to be successful in the United States, must have the broad support of the American people. And if that policy is not seen as being in the American interest, it is unlikely to have the broad support of the American people. The president's huge blunder, in my view, is going overseas and criticizing folks here at home who have raised genuine concerns about the safety and security of America under this policy. For me, I'll be quite clear. When the FBI director stands up and says that he cannot assure the American people that Syrian refugees can be effectively vetted, that ends the conversation for the moment. We cannot allow ourselves at a time of great peril to put ourselves voluntarily at even greater risk just because there are some folks who believe that it'll make our country look better here around the world. I have a large Muslim American population in my state. I think it's the second largest Muslim American population of any state in the nation behind Michigan. And what I'll tell you is that Muslim Americans are not nearly that sensitive, not nearly as sensitive as some of the people in opinion places here in Washington or in the White House believe they are. They're Muslim Americans, and they understand that the safety and security of their family is at risk, just the way the safety and security of Catholics are at risk, Protestants are at risk, Buddhists are at risk when the American homeland's not safe and not secure. This is common sense. I know the FBI director. I worked with him as U.S. Attorney in New Jersey when he was U.S. Attorney in Manhattan. That's what passes for foreign policy when you're a U.S. Attorney, dealing with the Southern District of New York. I knew him as my boss as the Deputy Attorney General, and I now know him as the FBI Director. He's one of the fairest, most competent, capable, and honest people I've ever known in public service. When he stands up and says that he cannot assure the American people, the president should be a leader that listens and listens to the professionals he's placed around him. When the FBI director says it's capable to vet folks, then we can revisit a policy that the American people could support. But instead, what the president decides to do, is to try to belittle those who have a differing opinion. It's not good enough just to disagree. You're smaller, you're lesser. That's not what a real leader does. A real leader attempts to persuade. A real leader attempts to cajole. A real leader attempts to bring people who have differing opinions in to find common ground. A real leader does not stand on foreign soil and belittle the leaders of states all across the country that he pretends to lead. I don't care any less about the widows and orphans of the Syrian war than the president does. Not one bit less. But my focus is different than his is. My focus is on the widows and orphans in the United States. My focus is on the widows and orphans of September 11th. See, they live with me every day. They live around me every day in my state. It's 14 years later for everyone in this country, but for me, it is a daily occurrence to look into the eyes of the people who lost their husbands and wives, their fathers and mothers, their sisters and brothers, their sons and daughters on September 11th. Their pain is no less today than it was 14 years ago. Their loss is no less today than it was 14 years ago. And the goal and the intent of the American president has to be, first and foremost, to prevent another generation of those widows and orphans on American soil. That must be your top priority. And your first priority as President of the United States. And so